on building inclusive and equitable cultures on boards and throughout the organization. So much, so much is written and said about diversity and inclusion and culture. However, the more there is written, the more people appear to be confused. I very often hear from board directors, what are we supposed to do? What is it that actually works? So I'm delighted to talk with Dr. Doyin Atewologun, Director of Delta, a consulting firm that helps clients across the world create and leverage the power of diverse and inclusive leadership. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series. I'm Dr. Sabine Dembkowski, founder and managing partner of Better Boards. We make the boards of the most ambitious organizations more effective. Our mission at Better Boards is to contribute to creating better boards. We do this by providing clients with an evidence-based approach for board evaluations and board development programs. We have created an innovative board evaluation platform clients can use for the external as well as for the internal evaluation. Large professional service firms are also welcome to use our platform. To fulfill our mission, we give a voice to all who care about creating better boards. Doyin, thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series. It's good to have you.
It's a pleasure, Sabine. Thank you.
Now, first things first, what does diversity and inclusion mean?
Oh, indeed. This is a question many people ask. So the way I respond to this question is, if we think about diversity as all of the beautiful, wonderful ways in which humans are different, so that includes things like ethnicity, background, culture, sexual orientation, religion, personality, schooling, all of those things are diversity. Inclusion, however, has a particular run-off meaning from diversity. Inclusion is about the degree to which, regardless of how you are different, that difference is recognized and valued, and you can bring that difference to who you are at work. So diversity is all the ways we're different. Inclusion is appreciating that difference and valuing it and being authentic with it.
Now, I noticed, you talked about the different dimensions of diversity, which is much broader instantly than a lot of people would initially say. So why does it matter to look at different identity dimensions?
That's a great question, Sabine. It matters so much because the way we are with each other in the world, different differences have an impact. Let me give an example. So I live in the UK, and your accent, historically in the UK, your accent can make a difference between whether people think you come from a wealthy, privileged, socioeconomically privileged background or not. But I grew up in the city of Lagos in Nigeria, where accent doesn't really matter in that way. In the UK and in a number of other places, other differences will matter more or less depending on the history and the context. In addition, some differences are visible and some differences are not so visible. So neurodiversity, for example, neurodivergence is not necessarily visible. Some religions are not necessarily visible. But other things such as, perhaps skin color, perhaps gender identity, or, the gender you look like, someone might put you into a category of those are visible. And so because we're different in many different ways, we need to understand that the impact that might have on people and on people at work. And that helps us build more inclusive cultures when we think intentionally about different identity dimensions and how they matter differently.
These days, there is so much talk about diversity and inclusion. What are really the challenges for boards? What are the challenges you most often hear from members of boards when you work with boards?
Particularly when we think about diversity and inclusion, because there is so much talk, the typical question I am often asked is, what works? What works?
Fantastic question. What actually works? Tell me the essence.
When we think about the question, what works, one level, I would say many of the things we've heard about work, if you keep at it. But what I actually want to do, this opportunity, I have this conversation with you, Sabine, is actually help our listeners to think about different types of work. So to all of our listeners, whether they're executive directors, or non-executive directors, chairs, company secretaries, like wherever you are, when you think about diversity, you will probably hear people have talked about, well, you know what, you have to do the work. But sometimes we're actually not clear on what this work means. And I think this work for all of us is something that boards, or members of boards, can role model. I think it is so powerful for us to think about the work that boards as a social system and board members as members of this powerful social system can get involved in. Yeah, so should I say some more about when I think about work?
Yeah, please do.
Work?
Yeah.
Indeed. So, I mean, even if we just think about the word, what is work? Work, it means effort. It means energy, right? It means investment. It means time. It means resources. It's all of that, right? Because when we think about inclusion and when we think about leveraging inclusion, either whether it's within boards or within an organization or in society, we know that this inclusion is necessary because of these inequities as structures. So a lot of people, again, some of our listeners will be familiar with the idea that there are structural inequities, these structures or systems that have been built in the way in which we organize ourselves. So they're not just someone being, rude. It's about the way in which some people have more access to different types of education. I want us to think about that word structure. When we think about the word structure, you think a structure is solid, a structure is constructed, a structure is grounded. So in order to dismantle that structure, it takes work. So for us to build, organizations that are gender or race or disability or neurodivergent inclusive, we have to grapple with how the world, how the organization, how your board is organized, and how it is structured, how it may be structured to be exclusive based on certain groups.
Now, I like that you point to structure, but very often I see in my work when I do these board evaluations that structure alone is not sufficient.
Yes, so culture, there's structures and practices and processes, there's culture, right? And I think it is so important when we think about all of those things. And I use the word structure because it really helps us understand that these things can be invisible and they can meet resistance. And so, yes, culture is important, for example, and individual action is very important, which we're going to get into, I'm sure, later in this conversation. And that all comes back to the idea of work, this sustained effort. And Sabine, your comment makes me think about what we should ask everyone listening here around the role they have to play in building inclusive cultures around them. Yeah, again, to the EDs, the NEDs, the chairs, everyone listening. My question to you is, what is your own personally compelling driving force to build an equitable business?
Why does this matter?
It is so important because if we don't have our own compelling driving force, if we don't know the answer to that, if it's not clear to us, it's not going to work. I think so many times you can find, particularly perhaps in some boards, we're like, well, you know what, that question, why are we doing it? It's for the chair. Or, it's just for the HR director, right? Or it's just for the chief diversity officer. No, don't think, all right, what does our chair say? What does our CEO say? What does our CDO say, a chief diversity officer? What does the HRD say? No. My call to listeners is, don't even say, well, this is what my children say, because a lot of people do say, oh, well, you know what, my children are holding me to account. All of that is important. But you really need to be clear from almost like from a deep psychological, motivational perspective. What is my own personally compelling drive to do this work, to build an inclusive culture in my organization, or to be part of an inclusive culture on my board?
No, great question. And it reminds me of some brilliant conversations I had with others on this podcast series who all had a personal drive to do something.
Exactly.
And these were the ones who had the greatest impact, no doubt. Now, what are other questions members of boards should ask?
I think people should think about different types of work. I am going to use this metaphor. I find this metaphor is quite helpful when we think about the different ways in which all of us can do this. And one of the things I want people to think about is what I refer to as thinking work. And I think that thinking, one way in which we can think about that thinking work is just an ongoing alertness to what is going on around us. Don't take things for granted around diversity and inclusion. So an ongoing alertness to the less visible inequalities or less visible structures and doing something about it. It's about being a critical thinker and challenging what we're used to hearing or saying. Because really too often we can parrot out the questions we hear, the comments we have other people share without really questioning what these mean. Is it okay if I give an example of that, Sabine?
Absolutely. We love examples.
Well, a clear example of the importance of critical thinking is often people hear, and I know many of these listeners would have heard this, people hear about there's a compromise of competency. We're sacrificing competency if we introduce diversity. And I want to challenge our listeners and say this is actually a myth. You hear it, but it is a myth. I
heard it quite often as well. Right? I can absolutely confirm it.
Right? And I tell you why it's a myth. And I ask, again, all our listeners to check this. Just check this in your own space, in your own environment, with your family, with your colleagues. Because most people who belong to underrepresented groups, so whether they're women or people of color or other underrepresented groups, they will tell you that rather than people lowering the bar for them to get through to the next rung of the career ladder, they actually find that they have to undergo a higher level of scrutiny. More hurdles are put in their way. So I just want to do a little bit of a stereotypical thing. Imagine the woman you're considering for that role, for that NED role. She's one of the last women standing. She's the one who has navigated assumptions around, kind of childcare and care and responsibilities. She's had to navigate assumptions about whether she can lead in tech or finance. She's the one who's been excluded in a number of informal, what we used to call water cooler chats in order to get to where she is. Or a person with disability, many ways in which they're going to I'm going to have to survive or thrive in a world that's not built for me, a wheelchair user or whatever. And so I do want to say that by the time underrepresented people are on your radar, they are much more likely to be exceptional because every barrier they have had to navigate when people don't want them there, they have had to show they are 2, 3, 10 times better. So let us critically analyze that assumption that when you're sacrificing competency, that when you're looking at diversity, you're sacrificing competency because you're probably getting much better bang for your buck.
Excellent point. Frankly, I've never heard it. Yeah, very often the discussion doesn't go in that direction. Let's put it rather that way than saying, I've never heard it. But not in the critical discussions. It's much more the discussion and the concern that you have to compromise in know-how, in performance, in merit. So that is really a great point you're making there, Doyin. Now, it's interesting. You talk so often about work, and you alluded now to some aspects of the work. That might not be very appealing to some people, does it? I mean, it's not just something fancy that happens. You really have to go for it. You really, really have to put work in this.
You do. And, you can do it from more kind of like minor, well, not minor, but like low key, low stakes, relatively low stakes. So sometimes I talk about talking work and I also talk about doing work. And so, for example, in talking work, many of us might be familiar with the idea of, for example, calling out behavior when you're in a meeting and you notice that someone's interrupting, or you notice that someone's ignored someone's particular ideas. And so one of the things that we can all be attuned to is calling out, or some people are using the idea of calling in, because sometimes calling out might seem a little too like direct. Whether you call out or call in, what you're doing is during conversations, interactions, you're thinking about how you gently, subtly, politically, but sometimes more directly influence behavior so that they're much more aligned with your own values of inclusion. Again, I just want to give another example here about how important it is for it to be you, because that makes it easier. Just going back to the question you were asking, Sabine, people are like, oh gosh, this is hard. And it makes it easier when you know why you are doing this. So a little while ago, a white female partner at a law firm asked me the following question. So she said, I was at this event and the speaker said something that was really quite inappropriate. And so after this event, it was inappropriate because it had to do with an ethnic background slur type of thing, not a slur, but something inappropriate. So what she did after the event is she went to the person of color, the only person of color who attended this event, who was a colleague of hers. And then she asked them, what did they think about it? How did they feel? Were they uncomfortable? That she just say, are you okay? How did you feel about it? And this person of color said, you know what, these things happen, and they brushed it away. They said, these things happen all the time. I'm not going to worry about it. And so this partner at this law firm then asks me, well, you know what, if it wasn't a problem for them, should I have done anything? And I'm pausing for our listeners. I ask you that question. She was at an event, something inappropriate was said. She thought it was inappropriate. She went to ask someone whether they thought it was inappropriate. That person said, it happens all the time. Should she have done something about it? The answer, dear listeners, is yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Sabine. Under no circumstances should anyone, a business leader particularly, see something that goes against what they stand for. And as a leader or a steward for that business, wait for someone else's permission to disrupt it. No, no, no. You have strength, you have power. If you don't do anything, that system is sustained. And I will pause there.
Coming back to the work.
Yeah.
Are there any other dimensions of the work our listeners should consider?
Yes, I would love to also invite our listeners to think about boards specifically. So the example that I just gave, was partly about talking work. There's also doing work that is important to consider within the boardroom itself. And I want to recall there was one paper in the Harvard Business Review that calls boards as social systems. I said it earlier in this conversation. It's important for boards to be strong, high-functioning work groups. Again, all our listeners will know this. It's important for board members to trust and challenge one another and engage directly on critical issues facing corporations, either with senior managers or within themselves. But we also know that the strength of a board is it comprises of different people, different roles, have different power and expertise that we can leverage and get insight from. And so there are a number of suggestions for really actively thinking about building inclusive and equitable microcultures within the board. And I just want to give a couple of examples drawing on the research. So for example, we know that first-time minority ethnic directors and women receive significantly lower mentoring than white male first-time directors. We know that they don't get as much mentoring, and they're less likely to be advised by someone who is already a director about how to navigate the boardroom. So what does that mean? It means that people who already know how that system works, for example, chairs, they should attend to things like, how often is this person included? How often is this person who comes from an underrepresented group, how often is their voice audible? How often is their voice legitimized or their perspective legitimized during board discussions? So there's different things that we can do specifically in terms of thinking through how can we disrupt the structures that happen outside the boardroom. Those structures, how can we disrupt them inside the boardroom? And the chair has a very active role to play to leverage from board diversity. And of course, this is important for any better board.
Absolutely.
Right? You know, I'd also like to add that when we think about psychology, also helps us think about different dynamics. So, for example, a lot of us are familiar with the idea of affinity bias or kind of social identity-based liking, essentially when you like or respect people who are similar to you. And so, again, research suggests that when new female minority ethnic directors are not so similar to their boards, then they don't necessarily have the similar chance to be appointed to be committee members and chairs or to have long tenure. So it's a really interesting piece of research. I'll just say this again, that if you are more different from your board peers, you have fewer chances to be appointed to be a committee member or chair or to have a long tenure. Right? So again, that can be countered by the role of the chair and other colleagues on the board. One of the things that the chair should do is to explicitly show how this person is one of us. That is one of the things I will say. Why is this person important? Why is this person key? How is this person a key instrumental member of what we're trying to achieve in this boardroom?
You said something very important, Doyin. The more different someone or something is, the more scared we are.
Exactly, Sabine.
I remember stepping out of a plane, sitting in a taxi, and this radio presenter was actually saying, what is the animal most people on earth are scared of?
Oh, I'm curious. What is it?
So the answer then was a spider. And the reason that was given is that a spider has the least DNA to us.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, this example always, when you just said this, I can see myself sitting in that taxi hearing it. It's years back. It always stuck with me.
That is so interesting. So therefore, I love that example, this sense of actually, this is so different. It is, like you said, in some levels, it's like fear. It is, just distance. And, and I think the thing is, Sabine, I love that we're having this conversation because sometimes it's difficult for us to admit that to ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So we want to put it aside. We want to think that we're good people. We want to think that we treat everyone the same. And one of the things that many of our listeners will be familiar with is the idea of almost like challenging the assumption that being, for example, colorblind or gender blind is the solution. We need to remember that until we get to a truly equitable and inclusive culture, we cannot be blind to the differences that occur right now, and we should work towards it.
I could continue to talk with you. Is there anything you would like to add to the work just to conclude on that aspect?
I think there's just one illustration, if that's okay, one anecdote that brings some of this that we're saying alive. We're talking about discomfort from unfamiliarity just now, but we were also talking about work and your personal driver. And I just want to share a story. When I was working in South African city, a little while back, again, coincidentally in a law firm, a different law firm. And we were working on building inclusive cultures. We were working with the ways in which senior leadership could drive this forward. And towards the end of the program, one of the partners came to me, and he was a white South African man. And he said to me, this program has been very helpful. You're giving us lots of practical things that we can work on. But then he asked me that classic question, what is the one thing I should do? to achieve this inclusive and diverse business we're striving for. Now, before I tell you what I told him, I just want to paint a picture for those who are not so familiar with a typical South African corporate setup. And this is the case in many institutions, many corporates. So imagine, like, again, pre-pandemic, imagine we have this canteen, where everyone goes to get their food. Typically, it is very stratified in a context like some cities in South Africa. By stratified, I mean that in the far left corner, there'll be one group of people, let's say all the Black African employees. In the far right corner, there'll be a different type of people, let's say all the Indian African employees. In the close left corner, let's say there'll be all the white African employees. And so let's go back to this man, this lawyer who said, what do I need to do? What one thing should I do to achieve this business, this inclusive and diverse business we're striving for? And I said, you know what you should do? When next you go back to the canteen, grab your tray of food. Do not go and sit where all of the other white South Africans sit. You take your tray and go and sit with your colleagues who also happen to be Black. I asked him to do that because it is a single powerful action that will interrupt the way in which we work ordinarily. It will signal someone who is powerful, who is senior, who is a leader. I am going to interrupt this, and I'm going to do this in this way that is right, even if it is uncomfortable.
Fantastic. I always ask at the end, what are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
3 things. Number 1, inclusive cultures matter, not only in organizations, but in the boardroom too. And so the work of diversity on boards should not just be one person's agenda item, but everyone's agenda item. That's number 1. Number 2, chairs in particular have a role to play, for example, in helping support the informal induction of new members, especially those who are different. Don't be blind to this difference, be intentional about it. And 3, to close, when we think about diversity as work, remember there's thinking work, thinking critically, there's talking work, calling things out when you see things inappropriately, and there's doing work, being seen by everyone to embody the new culture that you want to create.
Doyin, fantastic. Really lovely talking with you. Thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
A real pleasure, Sabine. Thank you for the invitation.
How can we help you and your board? If you're interested in learning more about our work, please do get in touch. We are also happy to arrange a demo so that you can experience our board evaluation platform. Whatever it is, we at Better Boards are always delighted to hear from you. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you for listening.